Cool. So if we're talking about player experience goals, there's different versions of this, like feelings wheel, that we can think about as like basically if you're interested in making a type of game, it's often useful to think of like what way you want your player to feel. And often, if we think of human emotion, they basically fall into like overall emotions fall into like these six at the center, basically. And these are like this is a thing from psychology, where like we have kind of maybe you start off and like this isn't like specific to games, or this is like coming from psychology of like human emotion. But let's say maybe if you want your player to feel scared, you're making a horror game. Okay, you might think about things that maybe make your player feel rejected, confused, helpless, submissive, insecure, anxious. And then how you do that is like you might make them feel embarrassed, foolish, weak, insignificant, discouraged, or bewildered. Okay, does that make sense? That like we can think of the player experience goal, which normally be one of these. So like if you're making Destiny, what do you think the player experience goal of Destiny is? Which? Sad and lonely, isn't it? Any other guesses for Destiny? Powerful. I think like the core of Destiny is like a power fantasy. Like it's all about like Destiny's all about the guns feel great, you feel really powerful compared to these days. It's the same fantasy as like Halo, basically, that you're like his savior. What about Mario? Joyful, I think, yeah, is probably like the one. Resident Evil?
Scared.
Yeah. Journey? People play Journey? Peaceful, I think, broadly, yeah. Yeah, even though that game has like it doesn't always feel like that, but I think that's the overall vibe of that game. I think I'm trying to think of games that make you feel sad or bad. Which? Kaizo Mario, yeah, that's definitely like the goal of Kaizo levels in Mario is like just to really make your player very annoyed. Yeah. Getting Over it's great, like a really interesting game to play, though I think everyone should play. Games that make you feel sad. To the moon. That Dragon Cancer, yeah, things like that. Often very like narrative focused games. And like often you might have a game where you feel powerful and like there could be moments of sadness. But like it's all about thinking about what's the core goals of your game. Okay. Does that make sense? So like then you can think about, let's say if your game is all about being joyful, like you can think about like things that are maybe fascinating or like that make them feel amused. Things that like are delightful. You can then think of like smaller mechanics that exist within that space. So that's the idea of player experience goals. So like, player experience goals include stuff like joy. You're making games where players are just going to have fun and they're just going to enjoy the game and like it. Games about sadness, where maybe your players, like as we said, it's just going to be a game that is something like this is a thing. Right, I often read academic papers, and like often if they're not necessarily coming from game studies as a media field, one of the things they'll say is like, games are interactive systems where players play to have fun, and it's like if you play games, I don't think we're always necessarily like playing to have fun. There's kind of more going on there. Games of mastery where we might want to like win or succeed. Games of discovery where maybe we want to find things out, but like thinking about what is the emotion you want the player to experience in your game. This is sometimes second to second or moment to moment that the player will take away. It's also sometimes just the overall experience in the game. Like, has anyone played the Outer Wilds? Yeah. I think like that's discovery for me overall. Even though like there's lots of moments of like feeling kind of frustrated or confused. But overall, I think it's a game of discovery is the experience. But sometimes it's hard to pin down exactly what that experience is. What do you think the player experience goals of Tetris is? Mastery, yeah, I think so. Yeah. And people will have different experiences with Tetris. It's not... People are very different. They're all individuals and will experience things in different ways. But as designers, there's often what we want our player to experience. And that's where MBA comes in, that like we can think about players having different experiences to what we design. But, ideally if you're designing a game, you're thinking about what way you want your player to engage with the game and what you want them to experience. But people, as I was saying, people experience different things in Tetris. This is Anti-Pixelant. He says this is like the experience of playing Tetris. and continues having things, let's call them pieces, dumped on me. When I can organize them into neat rows, they are eliminated. I start off very organized and efficient. Sooner or later, though, I make a mistake, and mistakes aren't eliminated, they pile up. I managed to fix that one and it's gone, but then I make another, and before I can fix it, another piles on top of it. Okay? So again, that's thinking about like someone else who like is maybe internalizing more of the logic of the game or thinking about it at a slightly different level, and probably even slightly different to the way the designer thought about it. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like one is easy and straightforward, and then the more to pile on because it's difficult. So again, another way to think about Tetris is like errors pile up and accomplishments disappear. Okay, so like the things you succeed at disappear, and then you get all the errors piling up. Or like another interpretation of Tetris is sometimes friends might disappear, but new ones will take it. Okay, so again, thinking about like this as like different interpretations of Tetris. And thinking about like ways that players might have different perceptions of what's going on in the game, or ways players might put their own interpretation that the author never had. Do you think it's okay for players to take their own interpretation from a game? Yeah. So, which?
We established that games are art and art is subjective. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like that's one of the things about art is that everyone can kind of. Someone could be like, oh, that's garbage, that means nothing, it's just like lines on a wall, and someone else could think it's like this transcendent amazing piece. And, that's I think, one of the things we can say as game designers, things are open to interpretation. Has anyone ever played a game called The Beginner's Guide? Cool. So this is one of those games, kind of like getting over it with Benefati, or Zach likes. There's this sort of genre of game that's almost kind of meta commentary on the game development experience. So that's what the beginner's guide is all about. And this is a review of it. If this all sounds heavy, it's because it is. The beginner's guide has been rolling around my head ever since I played through it in one sitting. Writing is pushing the boundaries of storytelling in video games and is creating some phenomenal art in the process. And this is a game really that's very quite autobiographical about his journey and development as a game designer and stuff. So again, think about what's his player experience goal there. He wants to put the player in his shoes. He wants them to experience the kind of creative block or creative challenges faced by game designers. So that leads us on to the MDA framework. As I said, player experience goals are what we want the player to feel. MDA is a framework we can use to think about other things that might happen in that process. So there's a paper. You can click that link and that's just download it. It's Robin Hunicke, Mark LeBlanc, and I can't remember the third author. I might have it on the next page. But it presents a formal approach to game design, game criticism, and game research. Okay, the idea being basically that this provides a framework for us to think about how games are interpreted by different people, and it can be used as a design tool to strengthen the iterative process. That's their claim. I don't really buy that claim. I don't think MDA is all that useful for game development, but sometimes it's useful for maybe interpreting what's happening in games. But definitely I think it can sometimes make it easier to decompose, study, and design games. So the definitions of these three things. Mechanics are maybe slightly different to what we might necessarily describe as mechanics. Mechanics basically describe the particular components of a game at the level of data, representation, and algorithms. Okay? So a mechanic in this case might be something like, roll 2 dice or something like that. Okay, that's kind of a mechanic. Dynamics describe the runtime behavior of the mechanics acting on player inputs and each other's outputs over time. So the dynamic is how those mechanics interact with one another, like what happens when they're at play. And then aesthetics describes the emotional responses. This is aesthetics is based on player experience goals. Aesthetics, really careful thing. That's the meaning of the word aesthetics, but it's often, if someone said to you that is aesthetically very good, what would you think it refers to? How it looks, yeah. I think in common parlance, aesthetics is kind of a bad word to use there. I think experience would probably be a better word. Because basically aesthetics can, even though it's technically correct, I think it's a little bit confusing. So some reasons to use it. Game design is a second order design problem. Okay, and what that means is we as designers want our player to feel sad Like we can't just jump out in front of our players and like give them a jump scare. We have to design a game that has rules that's going to make them feel like that's very sad. To make them feel scared. Okay, does that make sense? So the game is our interface with the player basically. We exist in communication with players through the game as kind of this intermediary. We generally want to create fun or kind of unique experiences or something different. Do you think it's important for games to be like unique or creative or innovative? Is that an important thing in game design?
To a certain degree.
To a certain degree. Yeah. 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 I think for a game generally to be successful, it has to have some element of something new or interesting. You know, like I think direct clones tend not to be all that interesting. Generally, you want to bring something new, whether it's like story or mechanics or like something new to the genre, basically. So yeah, we can't do this directly. So what we can do is create rules which, when interacted with, produce these emotions. And this model basically has us as designers over here. It has the players over here as consumers, and it has the game in the middle. The game basically is the intermediary between us. Does that make sense? Okay, so if we want to talk to the player, we can't talk to the player directly. We create a game that then talks to the player. Does that make sense? That's the second order part of this. And where that goes from is that we're working at the level of rules. We're normally designing like rules. Then there's a system that happens when all that goes into play, and then there's a fun or whatever aesthetic experience you might want to enter into. And that's where mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics goes. Okay? So we can think of standing on like either side of this, and this is where I think this becomes very useful. If we stand on like this side of the diagram and we look at this, we see the game from the perspective of its mechanics and dynamics kind of primarily, and we see the rules and the interface with the rules. It's much harder for us to like actually get, if you're designing a game, it's much harder to know, let's say, if it's scary because you've designed the scares. Whereas for a player, they're standing on this side, and they tend maybe not to be that interface with like the specific rules and the numeric values and stuff like that. But instead, they play the game and they have the experience of playing the game. Does that make sense? And the more expert, basically, a player becomes. So, like, I probably use MOBAs a lot as examples, but like any esports players and stuff like that, they start to have an understanding of the game from the perspective of like rules and mechanics. Does that make sense? They get a very deep understanding of like, oh yeah, this mechanic in this context creates this sort of thing. And then designers, as they become stronger designers, tend to get a better understanding of, okay, these rules lead to this system, leads to this experience. That makes sense? Okay, that's kind of where we're interfacing. So experience on either side of this diagram leads to finding your way to the other side, and that's kind of when it's quite useful. So yeah, we're here, players there. Okay, and that's kind of the key of MDA as a framework. So mechanics are the various actions, behaviors, control mechanisms for the player within a game context, together with the game's content, so stuff like assets. As designers, this is the bit we've direct control over. This is the numbers we can change and tweak. So like subsidies or taxes in Monopoly to maintain tension. So with a game like Monopoly, like what do you think would happen to Monopoly if you had like, let's say, taxes on rich players and subsidies for players who were maybe losing their money? Yeah.
Most people would like just ignore that rule, just play open.
Yeah, but like if people followed the rules of the game, like how do you think it would affect the dynamics of the game? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it would kind of, our understanding of like positive feedback loops would basically tell us that what that's going to do is create a negative feedback loop that's going to slow the progression of the game. Okay, that's exactly what. Does anyone play with the community chest rule? Where whenever someone, I think is it you get money when you have to pay money to community chest and stuff, you put it on the board. Yeah, and if you go to free parking, then you get the money or something like that. There's a lot of people play a rule like that where the money comes back into a player's hand, and that actually has this impact of elongating the game, basically. The other thing is a lot of people don't play the rule that like a property has to be bought once someone lands on it. That makes sense. You can't someone cannot land on a property without that property being bought before the end of their turn. They don't have to buy it themselves if they don't have money or don't want it, but it goes up for auction, and whoever bids the least gets it, basically. Does that make sense? In Monopoly, every property has to be bought, and that, like, again, actually speeds up the game. So some aesthetics we might think of, and these are coming from the paper, like so sensation, fantasy, narrative, challenge, fellowship, discovery, expression, and submission. Okay, like this is maybe going back. This paper is probably coming up on 20 years old at this stage. So I think the spectrum of what games are about today is kind of much broader than this, but at the time this is a pretty good coverage of that sort of thing. So things like dynamics are, let's say, rolling the 2d6, and you get this sort of bell curve shape. If you roll 3d6, what happens? So if you roll like 3d6, you're actually going to have a curve where like the peak is kind of right at the middle, basically. So you're going to have it's much more likely then that like people are going to roll in the central area. Does that make sense? You're making it much more likely that these kind of common occurrences happen more often. And then dynamics is, yeah, like let's say the overall system in Monopoly, like you move, you pay up for cash in, there's winners or losers, you roll. So think about like Tetris from an MBA perspective. What are the aesthetics of the game? What do you think the feeling of playing Tetris is? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, cool. So we can take the satisfaction, and then you're kind of talking about the dynamics there of like the clearing a line is the satisfaction, and then the individual rules. Do you think of the individual rules that get rid of a line?
We need to complete the entire line.
Yeah.
You can only rotate like 90 degrees at a time.
Exactly, yeah. And then for the frustration side of it, when like things stack up or you block off and everything, it's pretty much the same thing. You can think about those from that perspective. Often when you're analysing a game, it's useful to start from the aesthetic, then the dynamics, and then the mechanics. Okay? When it's not something you've created. When it's something you've created, generally you're actually trying to say, well, what systems or what mechanics or rules are going to give me this desired gameplay experience. So, what I want you to do is think about it for a minute, each of you. If you want to write this down, if you have a laptop or a notepad or something, or even if you just want to think about it or write on your phone, think about a game you've played and think of the player experience goals are. Okay, something you've played recently. Think about what systems support those player experience goals. Ask yourself, are there any systems that work against those goals? And how would changing the variables of those systems affect that experience? So I'll give you another couple of minutes, up until 12:30. You're not going to be examined on this or anything, or have to tell anyone about it, so feel free to just be honest with yourself. So, folks, hopefully you've had a chance to think about that and kind of reflect on a game you've played. It's a useful thing to do to think about, like, using this framework in games you play. As I said, I think it's much more useful as a framework to analyze games to see what's going on in them. Like, if you're playing a game and, like, it's meant to be a horror game and you're not finding it at all scary, take a moment to say, well, look, their goal is for me to feel scared. What's going on that I'm not feeling scared? What mechanics are leading me to me feeling, like, powerful or something like that? Like, sometimes you'll have a horror game where, like, it's supposed to be a horror game, but, like, you're just way overpowered or something like that. And, like, there's all these zombies supposed to be coming for you, they're really slow, and you've got infinite machine gun ammo or something like that. So, thinking about that from that perspective is kind of a useful way to use this as a lens. Then we have objects, properties, behaviors, and relationships. Okay, and this is developed by Tracy Fullerton in Game Design Workshop, if you're familiar with that book. I think 2019 is the most recent version of it that was first published. I want to say about 2003 or so. So, it allows us to consider game mechanics in depth. So, because the mechanics lead to the dynamics of play when interacted with, which in turn leads us to player experiences, it's useful maybe to think about this. So, this model thinks about games and the elements in games first as like objects. So, the objects are the basic building blocks of a system. Okay, systems have pieces that relate to one another, and these pieces are the objects or elements of the system. Okay, so if that makes sense, you've got a game, it's got like bits are related to one another. So different types of object types you might have in different games. You might have physical pieces, so you might have like physical board game pieces, the squares on a grid, the lines on a sports field, the players themselves. Abstract ones are maybe in-game concepts, so like have people played Settlers of Catan? Most people... Everyone should play Settlers of Catan. But if you haven't, there's like this concept of the robber, where if you roll a 7, the robber like gets to take some of your cards and stuff like that, right? And like basically you get to take cards off someone else and like kind of steal from them. But it is a useful mechanic, kind of like, but it's abstract really. It's like you roll a dice, it's a 7, and then the robber happens. But there's a physical representation of the robber piece on the board. And player representations can be both abstract and physical. Can anyone think of a game that has both physical and abstract properties to their characters? So abstract things might be like a good example is maybe even think about like RPGs or something like that, where some people are going to play RPGs with miniatures, where there's like a physical thing, and let's say you've the character sheet, but then how that character behaves and exists in the world is like an abstract concept, basically. Does that make sense? That like there's this abstract and physical element to it. Properties then are the values that define the nature of game objects. This is like, so we can actually it's useful sometimes to think about this in programming terms, because you're all such brilliant programmers and love programming so much. I'm sure this will be easy. But objects basically are like, you can think about this as being like game objects in Unity. Okay, so your player might be an object. Its properties might be the variables it has. So it's like its speed, its jump height, stuff like that. Does that make sense? Role-playing games, like characters and items can have values such as strength, vitality, experience. The audiovisual representation of a game object is also considered a property value. So the sprites or 3D models is a property of an object. They're like, basically, if you think of all the properties of a game object, you can think about that as being a single block, a single object with certain properties. The one thing with all of this is basically, and one thing we'll talk about certainly as we get like further into this, is like keeping systems simple is often a benefit to like the experience of the game. It's often very tempting to like try and make things more complex, to add in more mechanics. And there's like a French, I want to say he's a French philosopher, or he's a French guy anyway, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and he has this quote like, perfection is not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. Okay, which basically means that perfection is when you have a thing that is like, it's kind of pure essence, and there's not things taking away from that, basically. So you want a game to feel like scary, you create a game that feels perfectly scary. You don't have like, I don't know, on-rail shooter sections to make the player feel powerful, unless that's really an important part to like making the player feel vulnerable as well. The more complex an object is, like the less predictable it becomes. So we can think of checkers. So each checker has a color, it's either black or white. It's got a location, X or Y tile. If we think of the grid on a checkers board, it's got X or Y positions. And it's got a type. It's either normal or a game. Does that make sense? So like if we think about this as a game, we'd now be able to kind of maybe start thinking about how we program that. The behaviors are the potential actions that an object might perform in a given state. So behaviors are what something can do, generally using their properties. Okay, so Mario can move using his run and jump speed, basically. Does that make sense? If he's got the star power, he can run through enemies. Well, that's kind of a relationship, but like there's if you hold down on Super Mario Bros. If you hold down A and run, you can like do a faster speed run, like kind of this point. As with properties, the more behaviors an object has, the less predictable the outcome of the game scenario. Okay, but you can always also limit this by restrictions. So you can say, okay, Mario can jump 4 blocks normally, but like if it's got the superpower, there's a restriction that it can jump an extra block. Basically, it can jump 5 high. So examples are a bishop can move diagonally as far as it likes until it's blocked by or captures another piece. Okay, and then it has to stop moving. In an RPG, a character can run, walk, jump, attack, interact with objects, talk, learn new skills, fire, etc. Okay, so hopefully you can see how like there's so much more complexity. If we're like programming chess versus programming an RPG, there's a lot more going on. And complex systems don't necessarily mean they'll be interesting. Like Derek Wu in that, I don't know if it's in the chapter you read from the Spelunky book. I'm not sure it was, but one thing he talks about is like in that book, he's a chapter in that about like finishing a game and actually getting to the end of a project. And he talks a lot about like in the indie scene, a lot of people have like these beautiful like screenshots or like this game that looks really cool or interesting. And often he's able to tell like, okay, that game's never going to get released because so much time and effort is going into like modeling everything, trying to get everything perfect, that they're not actually making the compromises you kind of need to do to get a game out the door. So bearing in mind complexity doesn't always ensure things will be compelling or work well. Like that, there's game design as well to think of it. So our checker now has behaviors. So it can move diagonally one space, it can jump diagonally to capture. It has some restrictions. If it's normal, it must move towards the opponent, it must capture if it can, and it can make multiple jumps. Does that make sense? I can't remember, does a checker piece have to make multiple jumps if it can? I think it might have to, yeah. Yeah. It's the same way it must capture if it can, like you can't not capture a piece technically. But then relationships between objects are the key piece of systems. And this is a piece that's always tricky to get like right and get feeling really good. If you ever play games like, let's say immersive sims, so like Deathloop and stuff like that, or if you ever play games like Divinity or that style of game, they're really designed around this idea of like the relationships between different objects in the game world. That like you can have some interaction or impact on the game. And like basically there's this idea that objects without relationships, it's just like a collection of things. There's no way for them to interact with one another. So like a blank set of cards is a collection, a deck of playing cards in poker is a system. So if you remove the even number cards, you change the dynamics of that system. Okay, so you can think of a thing in a system like every card has a relationship to each other. So if you're playing poker, 4 is better than a 3. Does that make sense? Like in the abstract sense, that's the case. You can think about like what consequence might happen in poker if you remove the even cards. Which?
Gets a lot more consistent.
Yeah, and like it's a smaller deck, so like certain cards are more likely to come up. You're probably more likely to get, I would say, 4 in a row. What's a combination is going to be nearly impossible to get. Yeah. So like the only way to get that is to get 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace. Which? Oh, 10 is even. Sorry, I was thinking if you move that. Okay, so you can't even get it, can you? No, there's no way to get it. So that's ruled out. So again, because we can think of the system, we can think of, okay, that's ruled out. Now we've got like kind of a simpler system. Is it any better? I doubt it. I doubt it's very interesting to play, but like it's maybe interesting to try it and see. But because all the cards have a relationship to one another, we can think about that. And really, I would say like the core of, for me, the type of games I like to play, I don't necessarily want to say for all game design, but it is like interesting relationships between objects. So in a board game, these might be like the locations on the board. In a card game, it might be like the relationship with numbers. In an RPS, it might be like a unit-based type, or RTS. So, something to bear in mind. How a relationship is defined can change how a system feels. So fixed relationships stay the same throughout a game, and dynamic relationships can vary as a game progresses. Okay, so this is the kind of thing where, let's say, if as you're playing a game, like you don't get weapon upgrades or something like that, you're always doing the same damage. That's like a fixed relationship, your damage to the enemies, and it starts to be more so about like your skill as a player. And then dynamic relationships might be like, okay, you're getting upgrades to your weapon, so you're able to deal more damage over time. So relationships in poker, player 2s always leads us to a higher pair, and a royal flush will be the early line. In chess, a queen can be weak against a knight, depending on the location of each. Okay, does that make sense? Poker is a game of like linear relationships, like it's clear it's always the same, one thing will always beat the other. In chess, that relationship isn't fixed, it's dynamic depending on position on the board. Okay, and then sometimes you have things like in StarCraft, if you've got like an army of Zerglings, like they can do nothing against a carrier, you know, there's a complete mismatch. So then we can think of the relationships between them, they can capture multiple possible or can be captured. Okay, that makes sense. So we can think of the relationships between these, and it's really easy to think about this for checkers. It gets much more tricky once you start thinking about more complex systems. But if you can start thinking of your systems in this way and diagramming those out in this way, it will make things a little bit easier when it comes to design. So then, in addition to that, you have these relationships that are maybe fixed or dynamic, but then there's also like random chance, where like if you, I don't know, my son is playing like Pokemon Go a lot at the minute, and so like when you throw a Pokeball, there's a certain chance of capturing a Pokemon based on its like type or whatever, and the color of the circle it has and things. So there's an element of luck. There's an element of like you can do a good throw, but you can still not necessarily capture the Pokemon. And in Risk, battles are largely based on chance, but like you can put the odds of chance in your favor based in a game like Risk. Okay. What we're going to do, I think, is take a break here, and then we'll come back. Does that make sense to take a break here? And then we'll come back and we'll do this exercise to think about objects, properties, behaviors, and relationships. And then we're going to do game feel, and I'll show you the lab. I hope if we come back at 1, I think we can get finished in about half an hour. And that'll mean then you'll have half an hour after this class to get a chance to have a bit of a break as well. Okay? So. So, folks, what I'm going to ask you to do is just take about, we'll only do 2 or 3 minutes on this, just have a think about a game you've played recently. Like, try and think of a system, just one system from within that game. So, like, I don't know, if you're playing Elden Ring or something like that, you might be thinking about like something to do with the summons or something like that. I don't really know the game well enough to describe it. But think about what are the objects in that system, what are the properties, how do they behave, and what are the relationships between that and other objects within the system. Okay, does that make sense? So just have a think about it for a couple of minutes and then we'll move on. So let's say, so the objects normally are like let's say if it's like a crafting system or something like that. Let's say Breath of the Wild crafting system or like cooking system. Like an object there would be like a campfire and different foods. So food would be like one object with lots of different types and properties. Does that make sense?
Was like those couple of years
Do you want to
Okay, folks. So, if you didn't get that finished, like you can have a think about that a little later. It's just to get you thinking about like taking a system that exists within a game and trying to deconstruct it down into its individual components and how it works and the elements of it. Oftentimes, if we want to make something, it's really useful to analyze a thing that exists and think about how it's made and kind of break it down. Like my background, I've probably said this, I've said it loads, I know. But like my background's in product design, but like one of the assignments you do in product design, I think in most degrees, like you get an existing product and you have to like redesign that product, and part of that is like you take it apart, like you take every screw off it, you look at every piece of motor and housing, you try and redesign what it is. That's kind of the same thing that like this objects, properties, behaviors, and relationships allows you to do. The more complex your game, the harder it is to do this. If you're picking a really simple game like Baba is You or something like that, then it's quite simple to think about like what are the objects, what are their properties, and what are their relationships. You is Baba, basically. So we can see this as an example in Towerfall. Has anyone played Towerfall? No? Yes? Some people have? Cool. Towerfall is like a 2 to 4 player, maybe it's got 1 player mode, kind of couch co-op style combat game where like you're these little medieval characters hop around the place and you're able to fire arrows at other players. Okay, and then if you can see, we'll go through this system actually in a second. So it's single screen archery arena combat game where players fight until one remains. Okay, so basically like a death match. The core experience is frantic, strategic, and tense with systems that support this. Okay, one of the nice things about Towerfall, it's a really simple game. There's not tons going on, so the system's very like clear and deliberate and stuff. Can everyone see like how the green player gets killed there? Yeah. So we'll look at like what sort of systems create those mechanics. So the players are the objects. Like one object in this game is like the players basically. Then they have properties. So one property is like the arrow count. This player is shielded, and I think that player is shielded as well. Behaviors are archery. So there's an archery system that allows them like fire arrows basically. And relationships include like that the arrows when they're fired will interact with like certain things. So there's like destructible terrain and bomb arrows and stuff like that. So if you remember, we talked about it being like tense, frantic, and strategic. So to create tension, players have limited arrows but can pick up arrows from the arena. Okay. Why do you think the arrows are limited? Why not unlimited arrows? Yeah, you can't just spam. So like that would definitely make the game more frantic, right? Like if like everyone was just firing out arrows everywhere, it'd be really fun. It'd be like bullet hell or something like that. A single arrow or head stomp will kill a player. Why do you think it's that? Why don't you have like 3 or 4 health or 100 health and an arrow does 15 damage or something? Yeah.
The arrows look a big bunch and I try to hit in the first place, so there's like 3 health and like go on for too long.
Yeah, so that's like maintaining the tension. Anything else? Yeah. Exactly, yeah. It puts you on like when you play a first person shooter and you get like jam all over your screen, like that's kind of the stage where you're like, oh crap, I'm really low on health, I need to find cover and do something. And that's you start this game basically where like one hit is going to stop you playing the game. To create frantic gameplay, players move quickly. Arrows have physics properties. Okay, so again, because players move quickly, it's quite frantic. It means there's a lot going on. And then the physics is what creates that kind of situation where an arrow can hit off an object and like interact with it and change the direction of the arrow and stuff. To create strategic gameplay, power-ups can be used. Torches through levels will light arrows. So there's ways to use the terrain and the environment to your advantage, basically. So high-level players can actually think fairly deeply about this game and what's set up. Okay. So the last thing we're going to do today is game feel. I know you said you've done this with Baz, so I won't spend too long on it, and then I'll show you your assignment for this week. So game feel exists in like all three of these areas. So real-time control, polish, and spatial simulation. Okay, now at this very center, here's one the complete like Venn diagram of this. That's what's called games with like pure game feel. Okay, so games with real-time control that are polished and that simulate a physical space. Does that make sense? Okay, can anyone think of a game that would be at the middle there? Doom? Yeah, absolutely. So real-time control, really polished, and it simulates a real world space. Okay. Then polish and real-time control. Can anyone think of games that have polish and real-time control but don't necessarily simulate a space accurately? Minecraft is a pretty decent spatial simulation, I would say. Even though like it's an artificial world, it is a decent spatial simulation. So generally what we'll see here is like it might be abstract games like Thomas Was Alone or something like that. It doesn't really have, it's not really simulating a space, it's quite like an abstraction of what we would do. And again, some games might be focused just on kind of things like spatial simulation. Some more focused on polish than any element of spatial simulation and real-time control. Okay. Yeah.
Is there a reason that they're not one? Or is that just for like
So the reason someone is just to be able to talk about them in the book. If you want, I think the book is in the library. If it's not, let me know. I have a copy. I'm going to say has a copy. But like it's basically like here's the center, this is game feel. As you go out, you're kind of more at the periphery of it. So lower level numbers mean like kind of more core kind of game feel experiences. Yeah.
With spatial simulation, with like a representation of the real world also counts.
Yeah, what it tends to mean, and I do think it's like kind of when you look at game feel as like the overall concept of what it is, the spatial simulation is a little like because I do think most games have an element of spatial simulation. But yeah, like if it's a version of the real world and reasonably accurate, like I think Mario would count as a spatial simulation, even though it's like a fantastical simulation. Does that make sense? I think things that let's say maybe aren't really spatial simulations might be things like if anyone plays like interactive fiction or stuff like that, or visual novels, things like that. That even though it shows like places in a world, it's not simulating the space. It's just characters standing there and talking to one another. Does that make sense? So then the goes on. There's like I'm trying to like summarize an entire book into about 5 slides, but I'm trying to like pick out the bits that are going to be interesting. So like basically, there's 6 components to this overall thing feel like that we as game designers kind of have control over. So the first is the input, the physical properties of the input devices, how many and what kind of inputs. What kind of inputs have you used in your games in the past? WASD? Yeah. Which? VR and AR. Oh, cool. Have you done VR and AR controllers? Cool. Have you ever used a mouse as a controller? Have you ever used a controller as a controller? Some people have, some haven't. But yeah, basically, like we can think about those things. In 3rd year, we do an alt controller project and prototyping. So you get to make like custom controllers and stuff like that, and you get to design a game with an interface designed specifically for that game. But I think, did you play some of those games? Yeah. So yeah, that's basically like the kind of input that part that we have. We often don't have tons of control over that. Often we're like designing or developing for certain platforms. So what do you think is like a difference between designing for PC and console? Yeah.
PC, there's like a lot of different like, devices people can have. The consoles more linear, streamlined, like you need to do different options.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, and I've definitely seen like games ported to console where like the text is like tiny and you're struggling to read it. Another thing is the mouse, right? Like is a mouse and a thumbstick, are they similar? They're similar in terms of like they both like You move a mouse like that, and it's going to move like the head around the screen. You move a thumbstick like that, and it's going to move the head around the screen. But the mouse is much more fine-grained control compared to a thumbstick, basically. So even though they're similar and you can map the same outputs, one of them has much higher degrees of fidelity. So it's very hard to get like kind of that working. Like if you do crossplay on a game and someone's on PC and someone's on a console, it's very hard for the console player to be equivalent unless the game engine is kind of doing some work behind the scenes, like aim assist and stuff like that. Then there's the response, and this is the part we definitely always will have a lot of control over. We don't necessarily control the players like TV and what their setup is. So if someone like has a TV that's got a really slow refresh rate, we can't necessarily control how quickly they press the jump button and how the character jumps. But most of the time what we can control is like once we pick up input, how quickly do we represent that in the game? Okay. How directly do we do that? Like do we want something that accelerates slowly, something that accelerates quickly and then drops off? There's also then there's the content, which is basically like the level design or the world of the game, like the spatial simulation we have control over. And we can think about that, like we will look at that last semester in Tools 2. Then there's the rules, which is basically like a lot of what your course is about, like the mechanics, the relationships between, picking up this item and getting the score, between how long you've been in the level and what your time is on it. Then there's polish, which you've probably played around with a little bit, stuff like particle effects, sound, screen shake, anything else that conveys like kind of physical reality. Lens flare, like people like lens flare. Lens flare, I always think is a really interesting effect because in photography and film, often, unless you're J.J. Abrams or something, but often what like the director is trying to do or the photographer is trying to do is try to make sure that like they don't get lens flare because it can ruin the photo. Like, as in if like the sun's coming in on your lens and you got these circles and it blocks out half the image. So it's interesting that game engines will often sometimes simulate lens flare to make a game seem realistic. It's creating a filmic effect. And that can be a polish effect. And then metaphor is like, like the kind of the story or the world of the game. Okay, the kind of overall narrative and setting and that sort of things. Okay, the stuff you're doing with Domo, basically, that kind of side of things. So, what we're going to focus on for this week is the response and the polish. Okay, they're the two things you're going to have control over in the assignment for this week. So, when we think about response time, does anyone like play music or like do electronic music? No. If you do, you might be familiar with the ideas of attack, decay, sustain, and release. Isn't it? I don't know where that's written down. But basically, they're like principles in like sound that basically a sound kind of will ramp up. Like if you press a key on a piano, initially it shoots up and then it starts to decay, then it might sustain for a minute and then kind of go away, basically. So we can think about this as like Mario's horizontal movement. You press a button. Okay, pretty quickly, it's going to accelerate to full speed. You release the button and pretty quickly it's going to stop. Does that make sense? What way do you think that makes the game feel? Slippery? Unpredictable? Yeah, depending how long these are, definitely. And if the shorter they are, the more predictable it is, the longer they are, the kind of more like loose or floaty it will feel. So, if you do something like this, where you press a button, and like your 200 milliseconds there, your second here, and you're starting to see things accelerate, it starts to feel unresponsive to the player. Okay, so if you're like, okay, I'm going to accelerate my car out of here, and you press the button, and then a second later it starts to move slowly, then like it doesn't necessarily feel great. Yeah, so that's unresponsive. So you want to make sure your data is pretty responsive. So in something like this, where it ramps up very quickly at first and then gradually makes its way to the top of the curve, that again will tend to feel better because the player knows straight away they've pressed an input and something has happened. The game has responded to them, basically. And then you can do a short attack phase like that, and it's going to feel like very like tight and responsive. Okay, that like you press a button, pretty quickly you see things happen, you get to the top of the curve, and then you can stay there until you release the button. But if you've really tiny like response times, like you press a button and straight away you're at top speed, it just feels really really kind of stiff or like that, you don't have much control. So you generally want to consider some degree of acceleration in your input. Okay. And then, so that's the input and response. And then there is the polish side of things. And we can think of polish as being things like animations, visual effects, sound effects, cinematic effects. Okay. So cinematic effects are things like screen shake or like the lens flare, stuff like that. Sound effects happen. Animations, you kind of fire this weapon, there's muzzle flashes, visual effect. And then there's a rumble to indicate the recoil for the weapon. Okay. Does that make sense? Cool. So like this is one of the benefits of designing for a controller is that you do actually have an extra channel to give your player feedback. I don't know if you play games where like your controller will like start kind of vibrating a little bit in your hand and you go, it'll tell you that there's something there or something going on. It provides an extra channel that the player can respond to. That if they don't hear something, they'll notice that something's happening with their controller. So, are there any questions on that? Did Baz cover most of that stuff last year? Yeah. Cool. So that's basically the idea of it, like that we want our games to feel responsive and we want them to feel nice. So your project for this week is this. I gotta put this up on Brightspace. And it is awful. And this puts you in a scenario where basically you are you're working as a game designer in a game. You are given a project, like basically it's like you're given this game and you're there to, your job would be to, especially if you're like a gameplay designer, you have access to different controls to make it feel better. So at the minute, I'm going to show you how this works. Oh wait, it's back this way. Don't worry, we're gonna get there. And then there's a chest there that I like got and it disappeared. Okay? So no, I think you can kind of, yeah, there we go. You get through that. So things to consider is there's the chest. I'm gonna click that here. Okay. What happens at the moment when you catch the chest? There is a event here, and all it does is set that game object inactive. It just disappears as soon as you catch it. Okay. Again, that's like feedback to the player. Remember we looked at that thing from Gears of War, where like there's all these channels of feedback. The only thing that's happening is something that's disappearing. It's not really clear to the player what's going on. So you might want to consider what you're doing with that and how to like make it clear that you've picked something up or you've succeeded in like completing the game. Then you also have the player, who is here, and you have access to their jump force, their raycast distance, their rotation speed, their move speed, and their max speed. Okay? The move speed is basically, I think that's basically acceleration. But that's basically the dials you've access to. And using those, you can hopefully make this feel nicer to run around in and play around in. Yeah, I'll upload a video. This is a thing. Have you seen the Miyamoto video where he talks about the design of Super Mario 64? Cool. Then I'll put it on the Brightspace as well. But like he talks a lot about just making it feel joyful to play around in, and that's your goal here. And the last thing you're going to change is on the main camera. There's a post-process volume here that is making this game look awful at the moment. And it's to change the cinematic effects in the game. Like that actually at the minute looks better than what we've done to it. So again, it's about like tweaking some of these values and seeing like, so stuff you might do here is like adjust the temperature of this. That probably makes it automatically feel better. You might do stuff like You might want more bloom. The depth of field might be a bit too much. You might change that slightly. And then the other thing is just to use the camera. Is the camera angle good in this game at the moment? No. Really? What's the problem with the camera?
It's focused too much on the player.
Yeah, it's pointed like down at the ground basically. What we probably want to do is make the camera so we might even want to do something like that so that we've got a better view of the game world, maybe pull it further back from the player, try and find the camera angle that works better than the default. Is that okay? Are there any questions on that assignment? Yeah, folks, if you want to change the scripts or tweak things, like go for it, but you don't have to. Your submission for this week as well will be a video of, like, you don't have to submit your Unity file, it's just a video of you playing around with it. Things I would say is create particle effects and stuff like that for, like, opening the chest. Yeah.
Are there animations for the chest in the project already?
There are animations for the chest opening and closing as well, and that you can, but you have to set up an animator controller. So basically, like, what I would say is the character is a Mixamo character, so you're free to download different animations from Mixamo.com. You'll be able to get them there. It's fine to add in, let's say if you want like a crouch or something like that, maybe, but like there's no need. I would say this isn't a level design assignment, so really it's just about making it feel nice to move around that space. Does that make sense? But like, if you want the player to feel nicer and better, smoother movement, if you want the player to like slide to a stop when they stop moving, or like to fall off a ledge and have a fall animation, that's totally fine. But like, it's not essential basically to the assignment. Yeah. For next week, yeah. So yeah, folks, if you're putting in music or sound effects, it's fine if they're copyrighted. Just maybe in your submission, just mention where they came from. Okay. Again, this is like an internal thing. So often there's a thing called a if you're producing audio, like even for a movie or something like that, you'll often use like a public, like a track people know or are familiar with, or an existing track that you don't have the rights to give the feel of what the piece will be like. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to communicate the feel internally to the development team, as opposed to necessarily like this being something you're going to release. Does that make sense? So you just make that feel good to play. Cool. That's the old input system. Just because the scripts are like a little bit easier for folks to edit.
Yeah, but I think you're